It is plain, I think, that this old article was written about 22 years ago, and that it followed by about 3 or 4 months the defeat of James G. Blaine for the presidency and the election of Grover Cleveland, the Democratic candidate. A temporary relief from a Republican Party domination which has lasted a generation. I had been accustomed to vote for Republicans more frequently than for Democrats, but I was never a Republican, never a Democrat. In the community, I was regarded as a Republican, but I had never so regarded myself. As early as 1865 or 66, I'd had this curious experience, and whereas up to that time I had considered myself a Republican, I was converted to a no-party independence by the wisdom of a rabid Republican. This was a man who was afterward a United States Senator, and upon whose character rests no blemish that I know of, except that he was the father of William R. Hearst of today, and therefore grandfather of yellow journalism, that calamity of calamities. Hearst was a Missourian, I was a Missourian. He was a long, lean, practical, common-sense, uneducated man of 50 or thereabouts. I was shorter and better informed, at least I thought so. One day in the Lick House in San Francisco, he said, "I am a Republican. I expect to remain a Republican always. It is my purpose, and I am not a changeable person. But look at the condition of things. The Republican Party goes right along from year to year, scoring triumph after triumph until it has come to think that the political power of the United States is its property, and that it is sort of insolence for any other party to aspire to any part of that power. Nothing can be worse for a country than this, and the sure and gradual deterioration of the public morals. To lodge all power in one party and keep it there is to ensure bad government, and the sure and gradual deterioration of the public morals. The parties ought to be so nearly equal in strength as to make it necessary for the leaders on both sides to choose the very best men they can find. Democratic fathers ought to divide up their sons between the two parties if they can, and do their best in this way to equalize the powers. I've only one son, he's a little boy, but I'm already instructing him, persuading him, preparing him to vote against me when he comes of age. Let me be on whichever side I may. He is already a good Democrat, and I want him to remain a good Democrat. Until I become a Democrat myself, then I shall shift him to the other party if I can. It seemed to me that this unlettered man was at least a wise one, and I have never voted a straight ticket from that day to this. I have never belonged to any party from that day to this. I have never belonged to any church from that day to this. I've remained absolutely free in those matters. And in this independence I have found spiritual comfort and peace of mind quite above price. When Blaine came to be talked of by the Republican leaders as their probable candidate for the presidency, the Republicans of Hartford were very sorry, and they thought they foresaw his defeat in case he should be nominated. But they stood in no great fear of his nomination. The convention met in Chicago and balloting began. In my house we were playing billiards. Sam Duncan was present, also F.G. Whitmore, Henry C. Robinson, Charles E. Perkins, and Edward M. Bunk. We took turns in the game and meanwhile discussed the political situation. George, the colored butler, was down in the kitchen on guard at the telephone. As fast as a ballot was received at the political headquarters downtown, it was telephoned out to the house, and George reported it to us through the speaking tube. Nobody present was seriously expecting the nomination of Mr. Blaine. All these men were Republicans, but they had no affection for Blaine. For 2 years, the Hartford Courant had been holding Blaine up to scorn and contumely. It had been denouncing him daily. It had been mercilessly criticizing his political conduct and backing up the criticisms with the deadly facts. Up to that time, the Courant had been a paper which could be depended on to speak its sincere mind about the prominent men of both parties, and its judgments could be depended upon as being well and candidly considered and sound. It had been my custom to pin my faith on the Courant and accept its verdicts at par. The billiard game and the discussion went on, and by about mid-afternoon, George furnished us a paralyzing surprise through the speaking tube. Mr. Blaine was the nominee. The butts of the billiard cues came down on the floor with a bump, and for a while the players were dumb. They could think of nothing to say. Then Henry Robinson broke the silence. He said sorrowfully that it was hard luck to have to vote for that man. I said, "But we don't have to vote for him." Robinson said, "Do you mean to say that you are not going to vote for him?" "Yes," I said, "that is what I mean to say. I'm not going to vote for him." The others began to find their voices. They sang the same note. They said that when a party's representatives choose a man, that ends it. If they choose unwisely, it is a misfortune, but no loyal member of the party has any right to withhold his vote. He has a plain duty before him, and he cannot shirk it. He must vote for that nominee. I said that no party held the privilege of dictating to me how I should vote, that if party loyalty was a form of patriotism, I was no patriot, and that I didn't think I was much of a patriot anyway, for oftener than otherwise what the general body of Americans regarded as the patriotic course was not in accordance with my views, and that if there was any valuable difference between being an American and a monarchist, it lay in the theory that the Americans could decide for himself what is patriotic and what isn't, whereas the king could dictate the monarchist's patriotism for him, a decision which was final and must be accepted by the victim. That in my belief I was the only person in 60 millions, with Congress and the administration back of the 60 millions, who was privileged to construct my patriotism for me. They said, "Suppose the country is entering upon a war, where do you stand then? Do you arrogate to yourself the privilege of going your own way in the matter, in the face of the nation?" "Yes," I said, "that is my position. If I thought it an unrighteous war, I would say so. If I were invited to shoulder a musket in that cause and march under that flag, I would decline. I would not voluntarily march under this country's flag, nor any other, when it was my private judgment that the country was in the wrong. If the country obliged me to shoulder the musket, I could not help myself, but I would never volunteer. To volunteer would be the act of a traitor to myself, and consequently traitor to my country. If I refused to volunteer, I should be called a traitor. I'm well aware of that. But that would not make me a traitor. The unanimous vote of the 60 millions could not make me a traitor. I should still be a patriot, and in my opinion, the only one in the whole country. There was a good deal of talk, but I made no converts. They were all candid enough to say that they did not want to vote for Mr. Blaine, but they all said they would do it nevertheless. And Henry Robinson said, "It's a good while yet before election. There is time for you to come around, and you will come around. The influences about you will be too strong for you. On election day, you will vote for Blaine." I said I should not go to the polls at all. General Hawley, the editor-in-chief, he was also the commander-in-chief of the paper, was at his post in Congress, and the telegraphing to and fro between the Current and him went on diligently until midnight. For 2 years, the Current had been making a tar baby of Mr. Blaine, adding tar every day, and that was called upon to praise him, hurrah for him, and urge its well-instructed clientele to elevate the tar baby to the chief magistracy of the nation. It was a difficult position, and it took the Current people and General Hawley 9 hours to swallow the bitter pill. But at last, General Hawley reached a decision, and at midnight the pill was swallowed. Within a fortnight, the Current had acquired some faculty in praising where it had so long censured. Within another month, the change in its character had become complete, and to this day it has never recovered its virtue entirely. Though under Charles Hopkins Clark's editorship it has gotten back 90% of it, by my estimate. Charles Dudley Warner was the active editor at the time. He could not stomach the new conditions. He found himself unable to turn his pen in the other direction and make it proceed backwards. Therefore, he decided to retire his pen altogether. He withdrew from the editorship, resigned his salary, lived thenceforth upon his income as a part proprietor of the paper, and upon the proceeds of magazine work and lecturing, and kept his vote in his pocket on election day. The conversation with a learned American member of the Board of Scholars, which revised the New Testament, did occur as I have outlined in that old article. He was vehement in his denunciation of Blaine, his relative, and said he should never vote for him. But he was so used to revising New Testaments that it took him only a few days to revise this one. I had hardly finished with him when I came across James G. Batterson. Batterson was president of the Great Travelers Insurance Company. He was a fine man, a strong man, and a valuable citizen. He was fully as vehement as that clergyman had been in his denunciations of Blaine. But inside of 2 weeks he was presiding at a great Republican ratification meeting, and to hear him talk about Blaine and his perfections, a stranger would have supposed that the Republican Party had the good fortune to secure an archangel as its nominee. Time went on. Election day was close at hand. Late one frosty night, Twichell, the Reverend Francis Goodwin, and I were tramping homeward through the deserted streets in the face of a wintry gale, after a séance of our Monday evening club, and after a supper table debate over the political situation, in which the fact had come out, to the astonishment and indignation of everybody, the ladies included, that 3 traitors were present, that Goodwin, Twichell, and I were going to keep our votes in our pockets instead of casting them for the archangel. Along in that homeward tramp somewhere, Goodwin had a happy idea and brought it out. He said, "Why are we keeping back these 3 votes from Blaine? Plainly the answer is to do what we can to defeat Blaine." Well then, these are 3 votes against Blaine. The common sense procedure would be to cast 6 votes against him by turning in our 3 votes for Cleveland. Even Twichell and I could see that there was sense in that, and we said, "That is a very good thing to do, and we'll do it." On election day, we went to the polls and consummated our hellish design. At that time, the voting was public. Any spectator could see how a man was voting. And straightway this crime was known to the whole community. This double crime, in the eyes of the community. To withhold a vote from Blaine was bad enough, but to add to that the inequity of actually voting for the Democratic candidate was criminal to a degree for which there was no adequate language discoverable in the dictionary. From that day forth, a good while to come, Twitchell's life was a good deal of a burden to him. To use a common expression, his congregation soured on him, and he found small pleasure in the exercise of his clerical office. Unless perhaps he got some healing for his hurts now and then through the privilege of burying some of those people of his. It would have been a benevolence to bury the whole of them, I think, and a profit to the community. But if that was Twitchell's feeling about it, he was too charitable in his nature, and too kindly to expose it. He never said it to me, and I think that if he would have said it to anyone, I should have been the one. Twichell had most seriously damaged himself with his congregation. He had a young family to support. It was a large family already, and it was growing. It was becoming a heavier and heavier burden every year, but his salary remained the same. It became less and less competent to keep up with the domestic drain upon it, and if there had ever been any prospect of increasing this salary, that prospect was gone now. It was not much of a salary. It was $4,000. He had not asked for more, and it had not occurred to the congregation to offer it. Therefore, his vote for Cleveland was a distinct disaster to him. That exercise of his ostensible great American privilege of being free and independent in his political opinions and actions proved a heavy calamity. But the Reverend Francis Goodwin continued to be respected as before. That is, publicly. Privately he was damned, but publicly he had suffered no harm. Perhaps it was because the public approval was not a necessity in his case. His father was worth $7 million and was old. The Reverend Francis was in the line of promotion and would soon inherit. As far as I was concerned, I did not need to worry. I did not draw my living from Hartford. It was quite sufficient for my needs. Hartford's opinion of me could not affect it. And besides, it had long been known among my friends that I had never voted a straight ticket, and was therefore accustomed to crime, that it was unlikely that disapproval of my conduct could reform me, and maybe it wasn't worth the trouble anyway. By and by, about a couple of months later, New Year's Eve arrived, and with it the annual meeting of Joe's congregation and the annual sale of the pews. Joe was not quite present. It was not etiquette for him to be within hearing of the business talks concerning the church's affairs. He remained in the seclusion of the church parlor, ready to be consulted if that should be necessary. The congregation was present in full force. Every seat was occupied. The moment the house was called to order, a member sprang to his feet and moved that the connection between Twichell and the church be dissolved. The motion was promptly seconded. Here and there and yonder all over the house there were calls of question, question, but Mr. Hubbard, a middle-aged man, a wise and calm and collected man, business manager and part owner of the Current, rose in his place and proposed to discuss the motion before rushing it to a vote. The substance of his remarks was this, which I must put in my own language, of course. I was not there. Mr. Twichell was the first pastor you have ever had. You have never wanted another until 2 months ago. You have had no fault to find in his ministrations as your pastor, but he has suddenly become unfit to continue them because he is unorthodox in his politics, according to your views. Very well, he was fit. He has become unfit. He was valuable. His value has passed away, apparently. Only apparently. His highest value remains, if I know this congregation. When he assumed his pastorate, this region was an outlying district, thinly inhabited, its real estate worth next to nothing. Mr. Twichell's personality was a magnet, which immediately began to draw population in this direction. It has continued to draw it from that day to this. As a result, your real estate, almost valueless in the beginning, ranges now at very high prices. Reflect before you vote upon this resolution. The church in West Hartford is waiting upon this vote with deep solicitude. That congregation's real estate stands at a low figure. What they are anxious to have now above everything else under God is a price raiser. Dismiss Mr. Twichell tonight, and they will hire him tomorrow. Prices there will go up. Prices here will go down. That is all. I move the vote. Twichell was not dismissed. That was 22 years ago. It was Twitchell's first pulpit after his consecration to his vocation. He occupies it yet and has never had another. The 40th anniversary of his ascension to it was celebrated by that congregation and its descendants a couple of weeks ago, and there was great enthusiasm. Twichell has never made any political mistakes since. His persistency in voting right has been an exasperation to me these many years, and has been the cause and inspiration of more than one vicious letter from me to him. But the viciousness was all a pretense. I have never found any real fault with him for voting his infernal Republican ticket, for the reason that, situated as he was, with a large family to support, his first duty was not to his political conscience, but to his family conscience. A sacrifice had to be made, a duty had to be performed. His very first duty was to his family and not to his political conscience. He sacrificed his political independence and saved his family by it. In the circumstances, this was the highest loyalty and the best. If he had been Henry Ward Beecher, it would not have been his privilege to sacrifice his political conscience, because in case of dismissal, 1,000 pulpits would have been open to him, and his family's bread secure. In Twichell's case, there would have been some risk. In fact, a good deal of risk. That he or any other expert could have raised the prices of real estate in West Hartford is, to my mind, exceedingly doubtful. I think Mr. Hubbard worked his imagination to the straining point when he got up that scare that night. I believe it was safest for Twichell to remain where he was if he could. He saved his family, and that was his first duty, in my opinion. In this country, there are perhaps 80,000 preachers. Not more than 20 of them are politically independent. The rest cannot be politically independent. They must vote the ticket of their congregations. They do it and are justified. They themselves are mainly the reason why they have no political independence, for they do not preach political independence from their pulpits. They have their large share in the fact that the people of this nation have no political independence.